about our survey. So we've been running this since 2015, which feels like eons ago at this point. It was at the time and remains the only benchmarking research of any kind into communities and community management practice in our region. So there are a lot of folks that occasionally will research and study specific online communities or set of communities in general, but very few people are sort of interested in community management practice. So obviously that's what we live and breathe, and we wanted to understand what was happening with this work vocationally. Who was doing it? How was it growing and changing? How was it serving different businesses and organizations? And what about the actual communities that you, the practitioners, are managing? What's happening with those? It is open to and applies to any community practitioner across any industry or level of experience. So that includes volunteer community managers that might be, spending quite a lot of hours a week managing an online community for their favorite cause or their local neighborhood group. They're still doing the work of online community management, of community building in many ways. So we invite them to contribute as well, so we can get the fullest picture possible of who is building community, who is doing that stewardship work, that governance, that strategy, that engagement, all the pieces that represent community management, including the paid and full-time positions out there, so we can really get a sense of what this sector is and how it's maturing. Each year we ask a set of core questions around demographics, psychographics, community makeup, the role of your community, and different perspectives on the practice, so we can benchmark that year on year and actually track meaningful changes. And important to point out that this is independent research. So while the wonderful High Logic is, as I said, a huge supporter and our major partner this year, this research is conducted solely by ACM, largely by myself. And I am a PhD student at the University of Sydney and apply my research training and rigor as best I can to this work, so that it is done with an independent lens. And it is not serving any particular commercial purpose or agenda. It is intended to be truly independent and represent the reality of what's happening. I will say, obviously, the data is only ever as good as the amount of data that we have. So while it is enough to be representative of the industry in many respects, we know that there are a lot more community practitioners out there, even in our own ACM ranks. So this is just a little bit of a plug to all of you for next year's survey, which will come out later this year. I implore you, if you can, it takes maybe 10 minutes. I know it's a little bit of a pain, but it is so, so important. We talk to employers, researchers, government policy people now every day who are actually looking at this research, tracking it, setting salaries from it, really understanding what the sector's doing from it. So if you can step up and have your voice represented, it really helps us ensure that it's meaningful, useful data. So thank you for everyone who continues to take it. And if you haven't yet, please consider doing it next time. ACM itself, we were founded in 2009, for sort of the brainchild of Alison Mytalk from Quip and myself, after looking around and realising we felt a little bit alone doing the work of community management, wondered if there were others doing it. Of course there were, connected with overseas professionals and peers, and wanted to try to create some of those communities of practice they were burgeoning over there, here locally. So that's what we did. So it's by and for community managers wholeheartedly. It's a professional network and a member organisation for anybody doing the work of community. Again, volunteers through to professionals across any industry and sector. It's the practice and the work that we focus on as applied to those different contexts. Every year since 2011, we've been running our annual conference Swarm, which celebrated its 10th year last year, hard to believe. We launched a code of ethics for the sector quite a number of years ago as well, in response to different ethical challenges and problems that were presenting themselves for community managers on the front line, dealing with employers and different challenges. We get, we're told, get feedback that that's often very useful as a document people can work to and voluntarily sign up to. We conduct a number of industry research projects, chiefly this one, and smaller research projects with different organisations. Right now, for example, we're working with Mental Health First Aid Australia to look at the ways that community managers are involved in supporting folks' wellbeing online, and perhaps developing even some training out of that merges mental health first aid offline and merges our digital expertise to create digital mental health first aid. So that's an example of the kind of projects that we do. We are building out a training hub for community professionals, really kicking off with our World First Defamation training that we launched late last year, which has already proved really popular, to help community professionals, volunteer community managers, organisations and members protect themselves. We have regular panels, masterclasses, fireside chats, webinars like this. And of course, we have a peer support community full of amazing people like many of you who help each other out and ask questions and have got each other's back when in the work of community management. We also struck a partnership some years ago with Media Arts and Entertainment Union to offer those community managers that might be interested in joining a union a pathway that was relevant to them, because there really wasn't one. There wasn't one that fit exactly the work that we do. So that net has now existed. It's a very affordable option if those are interested, and it also offers you professional liability insurance, which might be something if you're a volunteer or a freelancer or quite independent, you may not have considered or may not be able to otherwise afford. So we tried to open up those options for people too. We turned pro, I like to say, in 2021, where we launched our first pro membership, and we have exciting plans to grow that this year, including the launch of our new Knowledge Hub and Forum very soon. So stay tuned. All right, that's enough about us. Let's get into the data. Woo, okay. So those of you that have read previous reports or come to previous webinars will know that community management practice in Australia, volunteer and professional, has been strongly female dominated for a long time, those that identify as female. No one's really conducted research into why that is. Certainly we have our own ideas and theories and hypotheses. You may as well. I think there's some really interesting things to explore that. It could be some other research we do. So this year, intriguingly, the gender gap has closed a little. It is still majoritively female dominated. 61% of community managers in Australia, community practitioners, are female, identify as female. However, that number has gone down quite a bit since the previous year. You can see down here in the lower right-hand corner, 2018, it was around 68%. It was surging through 2019 and 2020. And this year, it's fallen right off again. Now, until we get next year's data, it's hard to truly know if this is going to be a trend, but in a way, I hope it is. I hope that we are welcoming more men and those who identify as male to the practice. It's so important that we have diverse human beings doing this work to bring, the full range of their perspectives and experiences to community management. So that's just an interesting thing to keep an eye on. It has been and remains one of the few technologically anchored professions that is female dominated. What about age and tenure? Okay, so community managers are getting a little bit older. That makes sense. They've been in the game longer. The profession itself has been around longer. Not entirely surprising. Since 2015, though, since we've been tracking, community management has been sort of a younger to middle-aged person's game. It's been dominated by practitioners aged 22 to 39. The age bracket of 40 to 45 has really jumped this year. So those folks have gone from 15% to 27% year on year. And ages 60 to 69 are up as well. And I know that includes some volunteer online community managers, which is awesome. 46% have been working in community now for more than 5 years, which is great. That's also been on the rise. So previously, as we started to ask that question, a lot of folks were very new. They'd been in the space 1 to 2 years, just trying it out, finding their feet, weren't sure if they were going to stay in that practice or not. Now we're getting a clear body of practitioners who are community managers first and foremost, regardless of industry and context, and who are committed to developing their skill sets in that area. That's really interesting, Amber, in the chat. You have hired more male identifying employees at your place of work in the last year. It is something we're seeing. And look, with all this stuff, obviously this is the quantitative component of the research, but we have all heard, and certainly we have in gathering this and talking to practitioners, and a lot of anecdotal conversations and insights that support these points as well. From an education point of view, we've got still, it is a really qualified sector, right? So this is also slightly off from last year, slightly down from last year, but we still have 63% of our practice tertiary qualified, so at least an undergraduate degree, if not more. We have more folks getting master's degrees and even PhDs. The 3 main fields of study that those folks are coming from, so what are they studying at TAFE at uni? Overwhelmingly, the 3 dominating fields were media and communications, marketing, and social sciences, which continues to represent, which is great. And I think it really reflects how community management is adjacent to, in many ways complementary to, but distinct from the world of pure marketing and digital marketing. We ask community managers how they train, how they upskill. Are they doing webinars, classes, going to conferences like Swarm, things like that? An overwhelming majority, once again, said we are doing this constantly. We have to, in order to keep up with changes in the technology and new best practices, new opportunities, new platforms that arrive on the scene, things like that. So 95% are regularly upskilling across each year of their practice. So this is, that's not going away. We love learning. We are lifelong learners. Working status. So this is probably one of the more interesting data points, I think, and I do believe, and Robert, jump in here as well, because I think you've seen this trend at work. We're seeing more in-house community managers. So organizations of any kind, small businesses, not-for-profits, big corporates, who are taking the first step in hiring a full-time community manager, or at least a part-time community manager, someone in-house dedicated to work on their community programs. Agencies, of course, play an important role in the practice and continue to represent in the sector, but their representation is down quite significantly this year. Now, it remains to be seen whether this is partly due to some COVID impacts and whether this trend will sustain, but it's really interesting because it is new for us. So it's down from 14% of the sector in 2020 to 4% in 2021. Agencies working on multiple communities, which is of course quite common for agencies who specialise in any kind of community management. They're working on with many clients, many communities. That has also shrunk from 11 to 2%. 62% of community professionals now work for one business or organisation, and that is up from 59% last year, so it's continuing to rise. And 48% of those are employed full-time by that organisation. We go into a lot more detail around this, around exactly how many hours people work, the nature of their employment, working status. Robert, have you seen that at work? Have you seen, with all of your clients and networks here in Australia, folks that are stepping up and finally hiring their first community manager?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the thing we've experienced most is the number of requests we have for customers or even organisations that we don't work with as customers asking for help in that hiring process. And so it's always interesting, that looking for a job description or just some guidance on the types of people to look for in the market. And that always sort of begs the question, okay, so what prompted the need? And a lot of it is the maturing of community as an engagement strategy, or community as central to providing support for customers and those sorts of things, finally starting to hit that alignment with kind of core strategic objectives. So, whether or not the people who are holding the purse strings in the organisation have suddenly realised in the last 12 months the value of community to strategy and to customer success and those sorts of things, and then realising that what they're looking for is a deep expertise in their industry or their profession. And then the value that comes from having, because we have a highly educated workforce in the community management sector, we have people that are absolutely committed to ongoing professional development. Those things I think are starting to play. And so it's still an expensive thing to kind of invest in for the first time, but at the same time, there's high quality people available. And so we're experiencing that shift. We've had customers that we've worked with as their community management team, outsourced, if you like, for a long period of time, and they're starting to say, okay, we think we're ready to run this on our own now and get deeper into that. And so it's definitely a trend. I'd love to learn more about, if there are certain industries, whether it's healthcare or the financial services sector or utilities. Also, I think there's some more insights for us to gain there if it's peculiar to a particular industry. But certainly broadly, the number of organisations that we've helped look for and hire their first is definitely on the rise.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear, and I'm not surprised. We've seen exactly the same. Earlier last year, we, just like you, we get a lot of folks reaching out saying, I think I need a community manager, but I'm not even sure. Can you help me know if I actually do? And if so, where do I find one? What do I look for in one? Do you have a job description? Things like that. So we created a few templates for employers for hiring managers and things like that, both job descriptions that they can customize to suit their industry and their needs, and also interview questions for hiring managers who really are, maybe a bit stabbing in the dark. And, it is hard if it's an area you don't know a lot about, to know what questions to ask, to really truly know what to look for in a candidate. So I think, ACM will certainly continue that work, and we want to really roll out some strategic support for hiring managers to help them find and hire, truly great community professionals they can work with long term. And also, agencies and independent contractors because not everything does require an in-house community manager. So when they seek those sort of partners, to find the right ones, a sort of checklist they can run through to know what to look for. How do they know it's someone that's truly knows what they're doing and has the right kind of background as well?
I think the other thing, just quickly, Ness, that I noticed too, there's a change in the language that's coming through in these requests as well. And so it may be a bit of a lag sort of exercise, but we work with a lot of not-for-profits, a lot of it, professional and trade associations, for example, and the language that they're using is finally community management, as distinct to trying to encompass social media marketing and some of these other areas that would typically have been, oh, that's our community, that's the channel. They look at it as the channel. It's now shifted to actually what we would all know to be, community manager at its core. And so I guess we've really enjoyed seeing that shift in the language that people are starting, again, the decision makers are starting to realise the community management is much more defined and much more of a distinct profession as opposed to some of those other areas.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. We just as another anecdotal point, I teach one of only 2 postgraduate sort of university courses for professional community management, again, as distinct from social media marketing. And we've seen, I know I've seen, and Jennifer Beckett, who's an ACM member who teaches the other one at the University of Melbourne, we've seen a big increase in applications, enrollments and things like that. Obviously there's other factors there as well, but it's continuing to build momentum. We're getting more and more. My class is bursting at the seams right now of folks that definitely, some are just curious, taking it as a novelty, but many more who are saying when they come, I'm really interested in this. Like, I think I might want to do this for a living. I really want to understand it as a practice that's different from these other things that incorporates, strategy, culture, governance. There's so many more layers to it than different layers, I should say, than pure social marketing. All right, this is some good news. I'm really happy to bring this one to you. Obviously, there are still a lot of folks out there who are not being paid what they're worth across many industries, including our own. But I am so thrilled to share that community salaries are climbing. And this is pretty definitive. And we've seen this again, backed up by a lot of anecdotal reportage, a lot of verbatims in the report as well. So the average salary for a sort of community manager around so 2020 and prior was pretty consistently in that 71K to 100K range per annum, scaled down for those that might be working not full time. That's not bad. It's, in many ways on par or greater than the average salary in the country, but that has kicked up a notch. Now we have also the amount of community professionals making less than $30,000 at its lowest level since 2015, which is also, I think, really good news. We've also seen the really higher at the high end of the scale, those making sort of 130 and up, 150 and up, has also increased, which is great. So there is a step change happening. There's an interesting conversation happening in the global community management space right now. If you use Twitter and the hashtag CMGR, there's often a lot of really great interaction and discourse around that. Right now, there's a very working out loud conversation between our global peers and us around, what they believe is a need for more transparency in salaries and, more work to be done to advocate for effective and appropriate compensation. Certainly the US really struggles with this from a salary perspective, and there's a lot of what they believe are not so great salary practices happening. So they're really keen to have community managers paid more, to be paid what they're worth, and also for those salaries to be advertised with roles in a way that they often aren't. So that's a very interesting conversation. And usually when I share these figures with those peers overseas, they're quite wide-eyed at how much we're getting paid. So we know we're worth it, particularly those senior community management roles, but it is good to acknowledge that we're doing very well here on a global scale, and I hope that this continues. The highest paying sectors for community managers, and this is always very interesting, who is investing the most, who is awarding the most salary, who is also spending the most in terms of their community budgets, which is a separate category in the research. Health, and that includes, mental health online communities, therapeutic online communities, such as our friends at Beyond Blue, Sane, Reach Out, those good people. Government communities, so that could be anything from government agencies running communities or community engagement through to local government communities as well. And the technology sector. And that's everything from startups through to, big corporates who have large community teams like Atlassian and Canva, folks like that. So those are the folks that are paying the most, if you're interested. It is interesting that, some of the areas where there's still the most visible community activity in some ways, in terms of brand, FMCG, folks like that, are not quite leveling up their salaries accordingly. And in my theory is that's a lot to do with some of those use cases and how they're using community. But again, more to understand here, more research to be done. So good work. You do deserve a pay rise. And certainly if you are doing work that you feel is not being fairly compensated, you have data like this you can point to, and our global data points as well, to sort of say, look, maybe you should be getting more. This is where the industry is actually at now. Okay, let's talk about the economic footprint of communities. This is something we have asked folks a little bit about ROI before. We've asked them into what measures they use for their communities, what metrics do they anchor on. And what we did ask that again this year, and I'm not going to share that part today, but what I am going to share is 2 new questions we asked because we think it's high time, and some of our global peers have been asking this. If we're measuring ROI, how often, how so? And for those that are, and there's an economic or financial outcome here, what does that look like? Because we know communities can have quite a substantial economic impact, be it cost saving around marketing, advertising, sales and advocacy, R&D, product development, so many different categories. And of course, direct revenue generation through some really innovative communities out there. And we know there are some communities in Australia doing that work. So this is interesting because it lines up with some data you're about to see in terms of challenges that folks are facing as well. Headline here is we are not, as a practice, systematically measuring ROI. We're doing it really erratically and in a very ad hoc kind of way. This makes sense to me because any of you who do this work, you get it. There's a million things to do. You've got a community that needs you and demands coming at you, stakeholders, you're probably doing more with less, there's COVID, there's so much to contend with. Probably the last thing on your mind is, I'm going to do a systematic analysis of my ROI. But there is a direct relationship here between compensation, maturing of the practice, appropriate recognition and understanding, and strategic opportunities for community. The more we measure ROI, the better we get at it, the better we're going to be able to have these conversations. And if it's not something that interests you, that's okay. Maybe you can kind of team up with some other community practitioners and find ways to do this. Certainly, we've done some work with this already at ACM and some of our events. We always cover it at Swarm. We're going to have a couple of masterclasses around this later in the year that I'd love some of you to join, where we talk about the different categories of ROI and really how to measure these. I think some people sort of get elements of this, but linking it to business or organizational goals is still a challenge. And there's definitely still a lot of fuzzy area here that we can help each other do better at. So most are not measuring ROI. 26% have never measured it. So you can understand, why the value of that community might be misunderstood or even challenged at times. And only 6% are measuring it annually and 11% are measuring quarterly. So it's not a lot. They're low numbers. I'm glad they're there at all, but we can absolutely do much better here. On a related note, so those that are generating profits, revenue, some sort of financial ROI related outcomes for their organization, most are generating between 100,000 and 500,000 per annum profit, which is great. Those are great numbers. That's really, really great. And that is factoring in cost of running the community. So it's a true ROI number. So, inclusive of community salaries, any platform costs, advertising, promotion costs, things like that. So that's real money the communities are making for their organizations. 3%, which sounds low, but are making more than 5 million for their businesses annually. That is massive. That is actually a little bit similar to our global stats, the US stats that have just about to come out. So that's great, and I think we can do even better on that front. But that is good to know if anyone ever questions to you, the fact that community could be a moneymaker, if indeed that's what it's intended to be for an organization. Of course, there are other things it can do. Then you can say, no, the evidence is there. They can consistently produce outcomes like that. And if you want to go there, if you want to really lean into the opportunity, they can make quite a lot of money. They can be a true revenue generator. Robert, what's your observation about that, just in terms of, the financial footprint of communities you've worked with?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is where there isn't necessarily a culture of measuring ROI broadly across the business. It's then increasingly difficult to do that from a community perspective, right? And so if there's it's not even about having necessarily standardized reporting it, but it's having that link between the data that is being generated through community, and the data that's actually generated by the transactions that derive, a financial return, and understanding, well, is there, causation or correlation between the two? And that's, obviously that's, a lot to do with the technology that is being employed.
Yeah.
It's got a lot to do with, the individuals who are involved and whether or not they are data nerds versus being, empaths that do the great work of community but aren't so worried about. And if the business has a capacity for both, then they're more likely to be able to do this. Hopefully the software is getting better, so it starts to do the heavy lifting for everyone who's involved. But it also then needs to make sense in the broader, company or organizational strategy. And I think that's probably, there's still a maturing there for understanding what, I guess, value more broadly, when it's not necessarily ROI. Again, generating additional revenue versus cost savings are two different ways of looking at ROI also. Support deflection, communities are supposed to save the organisation money in terms of the cost of delivering support and service, as opposed to those that are actually generating revenue through sales or something like that. So again, another big area to dig into, but an increasingly important one when you link that to the cost of delivery. So if salaries for community management start to go up and the cost of running that, then more and more we're going to be asked a question around what you've talked about here. And so, hopefully we can dig into this a little bit deeper in future research surveys, be a bit more specific, because this is going to be super important to us in the future.
Yeah, it absolutely is. We intend to do some more specific research around this point, because you're right, it's critical. And whilst it's great news that salaries are on the rise, as they well should be, with that will come, understandably, accountability around, okay, so with that extra level of investment, where are these deliverables? How visible are they? How are they aligning strategically? And as you said, it's much more than just pure, traditional revenue streams. We're talking about innovative, product co-creation through community, kind of leveraging community to optimize a two-sided or multi-sided marketplace. There's so many interesting strategies in the way you can use community to generate financial impact for your organization. That's bringing down, I know a number of organizations bringing down R&D costs considerably as well. But we just need more conversation, more education around all of that. Big point too, as Danielle actually also raised in the chat there quite rightly, is, and you mentioned it too, the tools to help us get there. So of course, we need our own skill sets and around this, but because most Australians are still building community on big social, so those big mainstream social networks, it is limiting in what we can do there, by design. There's a standardization because of the scale. That means we can't really customize to any meaningful degree, and they're not really operationalized to give us ROI lenses on things. And of course, ROI is contextual. So, it needs customization. It needs technology and tools that we are going to be able to work with to make fit for our own purposes. And they just are not in a position to probably ever do that. So that poses a really interesting question too. And I think that we will continue to see the shift we're seeing with folks that are very serious about strategic community or revenue generating community, bringing that perhaps into an own social platform rather than a third-party social network where they can configure and own that data and kind of set up their own lens on ROI that's most relevant to them in their org. Okay, relating to this, of course, do people understand us? Do they get us? We still know that it can be really complicated to explain what we do to folks. There's always like the good parent or grandma test. If you can explain it to them, you're doing well. The good news is that this is shifting, and it's very much buoyed by ongoing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So respect and understanding for community management is growing, and that's reflected in those salaries, that's reflected in some of these other data points throughout the report. The amount of folk that say self-report that they feel understood and valued in their work for their organizations is up 10% year on year to 34. Now, that's still kind of a low number, but it is up 10%, which is great. Partly understood and somewhat valued, 23%, and not well understood and not valued, 7%, which is among the lowest that's been. So again, improvement, but still so much further we can go. It is great to see it. And I know so much self-reporting, including the verbatims in this research around community managers saying, look, the pandemic's, in a way been a blessing for me professionally, because people really understand the importance of what I do and how I can help folks through this time, which is great. So there is that awakening and understanding happening. Why are organizations building communities, be they a business, a not-for-profit, government or org, whoever's building them? Why? What is their use case? What is their core reason for being? So we offered a range of options from the most common globally, and also allowed people to report and add their own if that wasn't covered. And there were some really clear patterns that largely tracked with last year's data, but we have seen knowledge building kind of increase in these figures, which is also kind of interesting. So for the community owners, for the custodians, for the business or the company that is making the investment, doing the work and saying, we're going to build a community, it's going to do this, let me get a great community manager. Knowledge building and sharing, aligned with strategic purpose, topic focus, etc., is the most dominant, the number one reason, and that's at 33%. Brand loyalty, so extending customer lifetime value, building more meaningful relationships with customers or users over time, often is at 29%. And customer support, and wrapped up in that customer success as well, is at 29%. So both very strong. So those are the driving reasons for organizations building community. I'm glad to see that things like reach and awareness aren't on here, because communities, as we know, are not really good at that. That's where social marketing excels. Communities are inward-looking structures. They're great at deep relevance, not so great at reach and amplification, maybe over time through building out advocate networks and things like that, but it's not actually their sweet spot. So that's been a misalignment historically. So I think this is really good as well. What about purposes for the users? So we know with a community, you have to have a shared value exchange. You can't just be getting the value. You have to have an equilibrium of users, participants getting clear value, as well as you, the organization. So for those users, the number one point is access to knowledge, which lines up nicely with knowledge building and sharing. Number two, peer support. And that extends from those health and therapeutic type of peer support communities through to other types of peer support in communities of practice, for example, like the one we have at ACM. And then lastly, product, service and support, 24%, which lines up nicely as well. Brand loyalty, sort of relationship to brand, doesn't really ever appear on this list, which is also an interesting point. So those are the main reasons that both orgs and members are building community. Does that align with your customer base, Robert? You see that pattern?
No, that one about owners building for brand loyalty and users not having any interest in it.
Yeah, they're like,
oh, the other one that's come up more and more, and I think it's because HireLogic has such a large customer base globally and in the association world too, is advocacy. So one of the experiences that we've had in particularly throughout the pandemic is the organisations, companies that are having to do government lobbying, government advocacy, if you've worked with any associations or you're a member of any associations, they always say that we're the voice of the industry or we're the voice of the profession, as an example. I'm like, really? You're the voice of your members, but maybe not the entire profession or industry. So what's become an important use case for community now is when you can genuinely go in with a proposal or a white paper or to a government agency and say, this is where we got that information from. And it is a community of our peers, of our profession, not just our members, but everybody. That has far greater weight in the advocacy world when you have democratized access to the ability to have a voice on an issue, particularly environmental issues. And regulatory issues, and then be out, the organisation can own that and say, well, we didn't just survey our members, we surveyed everybody who wanted to get involved, and this is the platform that we did it on. It has far more weight, and so that advocacy piece has really started to take shape, I think, in the way community is being leveraged for good.
Yeah, that's great. I've seen that as well. I think, and certainly something ACM is aspiring to do, to have not just our core members who we want to love and serve with all of our hearts, but also to be as broadly inclusive as we can, particularly around these sort of representative matters where we're in a position to be the voice of industry. We are being invited to government submissions and things like that. We are talking to people about what community managers think. So I take, I and we as an org take that responsibility super seriously. So we will be trying to leverage that same approach. While those are the dominant purposes, and I'm really happy to see this, there are other use cases that are growing. Australia has really lagged compared to our global peers when it comes to particularly innovation and R&D applications of online communities, which are far more common across North America, for example. We are using communities for social impact. We're using them for content creation projects, be they commercial or otherwise, amongst members. We're using them for research and intelligence to in many ways save costs and in the other ways of doing that work and really understand a group or a segment or an area of our world more deeply. And ideation and innovation, as I said, which has always been very, very low, has jumped up from 1% back in 2019 to 14% in 2021. So I'm really optimistic about this. And I think it's still slow going, but I'm hopeful that we'll see more diverse use cases for community. And as someone who's has the privilege of working with a lot of different orgs and practitioners out there, globally, I can see how many ways this community as a mechanism can solve problems and deliver amazing outcomes. So, we are, sometimes I feel a little bit narrow in our application of it. So this is cool. This is exciting. So more ideation, product development, things like that. That's going to be really great. Okay, so you'll have to download the report, which you'll get, to let you know exactly what platforms we're using and in what percentages. And there are some interesting points in there. But I did want to share this with you. Of those that are planning to change a platform, and that number has actually doubled in the last year. It's still relatively small, it's 10%, but last year it was 5%. So there are more people thinking about reflecting on, maybe I should change my platform. A lot of that is coming from growing communities, needs to scale, different community priorities. But there's some interesting reasons here. They're listed out on the left there for you. The primary one is that need for different functionality. And in many cases, it is, similar to what we were saying, I just don't have the right tools here. These are standardized tool sets. They've got me so far, but now we're getting more serious. We're getting more sophisticated with our community. I need to do more things in more detail and customize those things. But I think very notably, ethical considerations, has always been a small factor for some, but that's really jumped in the last year. So that's gone from 3% in 2020 to 15% in 2021. And certainly, there have been very well documented issues with what they call the tech lash and the many whistleblowers and scandals and various issues that have sort of plagued by their own design the big social platforms, most notably Facebook, which is the dominant player in our space, that have meant a lot of community professionals and a lot of organizations feel less comfortable building their community there, even if they're working to build very intentionally around certain values. They don't necessarily feel comfortable building it on platforms and with technology that is perhaps committed to the opposite from a values alignment point of view. So that's just interesting. And I think perhaps is plugging into this broader trend around values aligned businesses, conscious consumerism and conscious capitalism, and folks who are saying, well, if we're going to lay money down or spend time working on with a tool, with the technology, yes, having to do the right thing is important, but who are they as a company? What do they stand for? What do they value in the world? What do they endorse or not endorse? And does that sort of line up with who we are and where we want to spend our time and effort? So we're seeing that conscious approach, intentional approach come more into platform choice as well, which is, I think, a really positive thing. That's a great point, Jane. You're absolutely right. Trust is a really big factor. Some community practitioners have been unable to regulate or repair trust when it is broken by the platforms and the environments that they're using out of their control. And so, and it certainly creates extra work for them in the process. So being able to create that culture of psychological safety, healthy, safe spaces where whatever type of community can thrive, psychological safety is critical for any community or any context, is really important. So if those tools and those environments aren't going to allow us to do that as practitioners, we're going to need to shift gears potentially. So another big trend that continues to grow and has been present for the last 4 years of this survey is our use of AI, automation, and algorithms, some of which we set up and control and configure, others of which are inherent and innate in the tools that we're using, such as Big Social. There are far more of us working with this now than not. We've got 48% of community managers using some form of machine assistance, which might be an onboarding bot. It might be machine learning to study, particularly those communities that have great scale. That's where machine learning really is most useful and valuable. Different automation, be that for moderation, triage, onboarding, or customer support processes and things like that. CMs, interestingly, are very into this. They're really supportive of the role of this machine layer and want it to help alleviate, repetitive menial burden so they can get on with the more interesting work. But they do want more control and visibility over their automated tools, which again can be a challenge with certain platforms where those tools are at work. Sometimes they may serve you, but because of the standardization and the fact that those tools are serving someone else's commercial agendas, they may not line up with your community, your needs, your context. So, here's a quote from one survey respondent, with better tools, we wouldn't have to work 24/7. Which is certainly also an ongoing issue. This is the topic of my PhD, so I'm a bit biased. I'm very interested in it, and I think this is certainly reflective of the patterns I'm seeing in my research as well. Robert, what are you seeing? I know HighLogic has multiple layers of automation. Have you seen that grow substantially in the last 12 months?
Yeah, it's definitely growing, and I think the reason for using it or the reason for leveraging it is starting to change. So, to Jason's point, the robot overlords are helping us do the things that are now table stakes. Even 3 or 4 years ago, they potentially would be the nice to haves around moderation, for instance. The ability to pick up on keywords in discussion forums and posts and things like that and automatically put them into moderation if they're trigger. That stuff's table stakes now. Where we're seeing a lot more uptake and where we're doing a lot more work, I guess, to speak to HighLogic specifically, is in the ability to build these automation rules. So to that point, it's the stuff that gives the community manager the tool to say, this is where I'm ready to have help, and I'm willing to let the software to do the work for you because I've learned about a journey that is great for onboarding new members to the community, or it's great for leveraging, cross-referencing information in resource libraries. And so they can build their own recipes within the platform to go, okay, I've tested this out, I've done the research, this works, let me build the recipe so that the software does that work for everybody that falls into that bucket. That's where we're getting a lot of value now. I think where our community managers are getting a lot of value, because that's still the part that they control the experience, but then they let the software do the work. The rest of it is fast becoming the kind of table stakes. And then the really fun stuff, of course, is when the data starts to drive value back to the team managing the community as well as the user. Hey, lots of people are doing this and following this path, and it's arrived at a point that we would never thought of them arriving at before. Let's do something there that, potentially, and in a lot of cases, that starts to speak to the ROI. Because if you're getting people to follow a path and they end up somewhere where there's actually an opportunity to monetize that data set, well, that's the software finally doing the heavy lifting for us. And so it's great that you're doing the research in this area, because we need more information about where it's adding value, or perhaps where it's detracting from the user experience somewhat. But again, it's really interesting to see what community managers are saying about it, and that we're still wanting our own. It's we use the word control, but it's our own ability to adapt it to suit where we're going with the community, as opposed to the software being allowed to assume what we're trying to get out of it.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That just being able to, I refer to community managers working with AI and these automated tools as context coaches. We're all about, nudging it in the direction of the context that suits our culture, our goals, our objectives, all those sort of things. And then you work in a true partnership rather than, as Danielle beautifully put in the chat, AI that can help us do things like manage copyright violations from UGC is great. AI that helps review context of word usage, again, great. AI that thinks it can replace the empathy of a CM, not so much. And we know that certainly to this point is not possible, and in fact can create some pretty serious harms. So interesting to know. I think, we certainly need to get more comfortable working alongside machine intelligence in communities, because it's already here, certainly here to stay, and sort of defend our, the importance of us having that configuration oversight, as you said, Robert.
Yeah, looking from that customer back, I think is important. So the customer experience, the user experience, and working backwards and going, well, that has been a delightful experience. And actually it was AI, it was machine learning that helped us generate that experience. we're going to get much more comfortable with that in the future. And I think that's an important distinction. So.
Yeah, I love it. All right. Every year we ask folks about challenges they face. We ask them what they love about the practice and what they want to do more of. We ask them what's a problem in various ways. Pretty consistently year on year, although the numbers move slightly, are these three big buckets. And obviously they're all kind of connected, particularly communicating ROI and ineffective measurement. People don't know how to do this. They don't know how, or they don't have the right tools. They know how, or they don't have enough time because of various mental health or well-being challenges, the pressures of the work, expectations that are unrealistic, things like that. Ineffective tools to do so. Mental health and well-being, especially for those community managers that are working on social media thoroughfares, remains a big problem where they cannot control. They may be able to control to a limited degree what's happening in their space or their part of the space, but they can't control the broader environment. And of course, it seeps in by design in those big social networks. So that is a massive problem. And you can see both of these comments from folks who took the survey. Management doesn't want to hear about the metrics that have real impact, and that's a different dimension on this challenge. And being exposed to bigotry, as many of us know all too well, is exhausting, is depleting, and a massive, massive problem. Please do read through the survey. There's a lot of really amazing data here and a lot of really insightful verbatims from our community managers about this. We've continued to track the impacts of COVID-19, generally to be expected. Certainly community managers continue to report, as with last year, many more demands on their time. The increased pressures and burnout of some of those demands, more recognition of community value, which you saw reflected in those earlier stats. And this is an interesting one. Again, those that are operating on those thoroughfares in particular, but not exclusively, because as a society, as a planet, we're exhausted, we're depleted, we have pandemic fatigue syndrome. There's so many stresses and challenges that we continue to face in various ways. People are polarized, people are anxious, people are angry. There's a lot of fractious stuff happening. And of course, we carry that into our communities, and our members carry that into their communities, regardless of what the topic of that community is. So community managers are seeing that, they're seeing that trend, they're noting people's, the rise of tension, the rise of anxiety, which is playing out, and they are having to contend with in a different way. As the chat just observed, humans are in a bad place. They're in a bad mood right now. And in some cases, they're taking it out on their communities. In 2022, 19% of community professionals say that they expect community to continue to be more strategic and significant, which is great. That was a very strong result. And sort of the double edge of that, 12% say, despite that, we expect more budget cuts due to ongoing economic pressures. So again, this doing more with less. The one upshot of that, arguably, is that it requires us to create a lot of focus. We need to get really specific and explicit about why we're showing up and what we're doing. We cannot be building these big, broad church communities to serve all the people and all the things. There's just not enough time in the day, not enough money, not enough bandwidth. We have to be very focused. And I do think that'll drive some further positive outcomes in terms of ROI and those factors. Nearly done. We continue to ask how folks are thinking about strategy. Are they documenting it? This has always been a little bit of a worrying, understandable, but worrying statistic. Year on year, generally folks still aren't finding the time or finding the capability to create strategies. They're in reactive mode too often. 45% of community managers say they work to a strategy, which is still quite a low number. And only 32% have any version of that documented, which is, again, a little bit of a worry. We know you can't realistically build strategy beyond 12 months at this point, really 3 months. But even, strategic plans about the roadmap for that community, why you're showing up, the kind of community programming you want to work on. There's a real gap here, and we are very much held hostage to reactivity and some of those issues we were just talking about. And we know that strategy is a key pathway to ROI and to recognition. So it is critical that we close this gap. Moderation, this is the first year we asked about moderation. We know it's happening, driven by things like the Volaverse and its nationwide ruling and appeal, the new Online Safety Act, which came into being January 23rd this year. Moderation, trained, responsible moderation is becoming more important than ever for communities, which is great. 85% of community managers of all kinds, so they're using a combination of post-moderation and reactive moderation. There are 3 types. Pre-moderation is another option, which is quite risky in a number of ways, so I'm not surprised not to see that on the list. That's good, that's great. The 15% that aren't there, though, worry me. So we'd like to see even more attention on this, not to create censorious environments, but to create that scaffold for effective, thriving communities that are getting the business of their community done, and environments where people can feel psychologically safe. We also ask community managers what they want. What do they want more of? This is obviously of interest to us and interest of the industry in general. We are seeing a growing call for, this is up more and more, year in year, big jump this time, some sort of national accreditation or standards around our practices, some sort of certification, whatever that might look like. We're certainly thinking a lot about this because there are always in any practice less than savoury operators, a great variance in the way people do this work. While still allowing for those variances, we want to make sure that people that are hiring those community managers are getting people that really know what they're doing. There are some big stakes here in terms of emotional health, social harms, trauma, all sorts of different things that show up in community. So having responsible, trained people to manage those is really important. Trained and supported people, I should say. The need for resources and templates went down a bit. We like to think that's because we produced quite a lot of them last year. I hope that's a small part of it. Certainly we'll keep doing that. And the need for support in building business cases continues to be strong as well. Here are just a few quotes that we wanted to share. The type of comments that we have in this survey, and there's plenty more. I think these are really interesting. There's a fairly defined fork in the road now between community management and paid digital ads / funnels. There is more focus on professional development and more appetite to grow customer communities around their product, service, or offering. Organizations still don't fully understand this work, do too much with far too little. Potential is there, but we need to keep educating people about the distinction of the practice. I like this one. If ever there was a time for community as a discipline to shine, it's the next 5 years. This last comment is pretty pointed, and I'm sure there are a lot of folks that feel this. I find the demand for community managers to have a huge skill set is on the increase. If it wasn't for companies wanting a full circus act on the pay rate of a single clown, I would probably devote more to the profession. It's a great quote. Amazing. And that is obviously a problem as well. And in a lot of industries, people want unicorns, the accountant / empath / 50 other things. So we need to be investing in our development, but also realistic about where we're at. All right, just to finish up here, some high-level data points about how we compare to our global peers. So we do in Australia have fewer senior community roles. We measure what those roles look like in the survey. And globally, in particular North America, but also in Europe and even across parts of Asia, we have fewer senior roles. We have more junior and intermediate roles. We have a dominance of social media platforms that is not surprising, but is problematic continues to be problematic in some key ways. While they are still very well strongly represented in other countries' data as well, because of those different use cases, innovation, R&D, in India, the dominant type of community is developer relations communities. So those are very rarely going to be built on public social media platforms. They're going to be built on Slacks and Discords and private forums and things like that. So because of the nature of our communities, we are over-relying on big social, and there are some dependency issues, some ethical issues, and some other considerations that make real for us. There are fewer of those more diverse use cases than there are in other countries. We here, though, have a really strong focus on professional support and advocacy that other countries are really only now really starting to lean into. So we're really proud of that, and it's something you can all be proud of, absolutely. We've done quite a lot. We've done a really unprecedented amount compared to our global peers in terms of working with researchers, with government. The fact that community managers are submitting to government bodies and inquiries and legislation, helping shape that is unheard of in most other countries. So I think that's really cool, something we care about and will continue to do, but we still have so much more work to do, granted. And we also hear, largely because of the regulatory environment in Australia, there is more regulation, there is more to be, more landmines to be aware of. We do have a greater focus than some of our global colleagues on healthy community building and governance and moderation. When I talk about these issues amongst global peers, it's definitely less front of mind, and it's less a necessity and more an afterthought or a nice to have. Whereas here it is, for many reasons, a necessity. So that's that's kind of interesting as well, that we are strong advocates, working very diversely across different groups and stakeholders, and we are very invested in healthy community building.